At 3:47 a.m., holding the broken pieces of a coffee mug I'd just thrown at my kitchen wall, I heard God laugh. Not at me, with me. And that's when I discovered that my hot flashes weren't killing my faith. They were birthing it into something I'd never imagined possible. If you're a Christian woman over 50 who's been Googling "Am I losing my faith or just estrogen at ungodly hours?" this next 35 minutes will change everything. Because what Grace Whitmore discovered in her menopause journey at 56 isn't just revolutionary. It's the secret the church doesn't want to talk about. Here's the truth bomb. Your hormonal chaos isn't interrupting your spiritual life. It is your spiritual life. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why thousands of women are now setting their alarms for 5 a.m., not to fight through prayer, but to flow through something called soul flowing. But I'm warning you now, this story will wreck your idea of what spiritual maturity looks like. Grace went from being a prayer warrior who had all the answers to a woman who threw mugs at walls and found God in the mess. She discovered that the very symptoms that made her feel like a spiritual failure were actually preparing her for the most powerful ministry of her life. So grab your coffee, don't throw it, silence your phone, and prepare to discover why menopause might be the most spiritually significant season of your entire life. Because in exactly 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you about the Tuesday morning when Grace's emotions stopped making sense and started making miracles. The kitchen timer beeped at 6:42 p.m., but Grace Whitmore couldn't remember what she'd been cooking. She stood frozen at the stove, spatula in hand, watching steam rise from an empty pan while tears streamed down her face. The third time today she'd cried without knowing why. At 56, she'd navigated teenage daughters, career changes, her mother's Alzheimer's diagnosis. She'd been the family rock, the church volunteer coordinator, the friend everyone called in crisis. But now her own emotions felt like strangers crashing through her carefully ordered life. "Lord, what is happening to me?" she whispered to the ceiling fan, but even prayer felt different, like shouting into cotton. The hot flashes had started 3 months ago. Her doctor had smiled knowingly, handed her pamphlets about hormone therapy, vitamin D, exercise routines, medical explanations for a medical transition. But no one had warned her that menopause would feel like losing the operating manual to her own soul. That evening, she sat with her husband Jim on the porch. He held her hand while she tried to explain, "It's not just the mood swings. It's like someone scrambled the frequency I've been tuned to for 30 years. I can't find God's voice anymore. I can't find my voice anymore." Jim squeezed her hand tighter. "Maybe you're just exhausted. You've been carrying everyone else for so long." But Grace knew this was different. This wasn't tiredness you could sleep off. This was transformation disguised as deterioration, though she wouldn't understand that for months. The worst part, she couldn't even articulate what she'd lost. It was like trying to describe a color that had suddenly vanished from the spectrum. You knew something essential was missing, but the words to name it had vanished too. Cliffhanger. But losing her voice was exactly what needed to happen first. Sunday morning used to be Grace's anchor. The weight of her grandmother's Bible in her lap, the familiar rhythm of worship, the certainty that filled her chest during communion. But sitting in the third pew at Cornerstone Fellowship, she felt like an actress who'd forgotten her lines. Pastor Williams spoke about mountain-moving faith. Grace stared at her hands, remembering how just last year she'd taught the women's Bible study on that exact passage. Now she couldn't even move the mountain of exhaustion pressing against her ribs. "Increase our faith." The congregation prayed in unison. Grace mouthed the words, but inside she was screaming a different prayer. Where did mine go? The woman beside her, Sandra, 20 years in the same pew, squeezed her shoulder during the blessing. "You okay, honey? You look tired." Tired. If only it were that simple. How could she explain that her faith hadn't abandoned her, but had somehow shifted into a language she no longer understood? Like trying to read scripture through fogged glass, everything familiar now, blurred and distant. That afternoon, she opened her prayer journal. The last entry was from 2 months ago. Confident declarations, thanksgiving lists, intercessory prayers for others. Today, She could only write 3 words. Help me understand. Then she added something that shocked her as she wrote it. Or help me stop needing to understand. Where had that come from? Grace had built her entire spiritual life on understanding, studying, knowing, explaining God's word. But something deeper was stirring, something that didn't need words or comprehension. She flipped back through years of journals. So many certainties. So many answered prayers noted with exclamation points. So much confidence in her ability to hear God clearly. Had it all been real? Or had she just been better at pretending back then? Tuesday, 2:15 p.m. Grace sat in her parked car outside the grocery store, sobbing over a shopping list. Eggs, milk, bread, ordinary words that suddenly felt impossible. A young mother walked by pushing a stroller, glancing at Grace with concern, and that made her cry harder. She wasn't sad. She wasn't happy. She wasn't anything she could name, and that terrified her more than the tears themselves. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter Emma. Mom, you forgot to pick up my prescription again. Everything okay? Everything was not okay. Grace had forgotten 3 appointments this week. She'd put salt in her coffee yesterday. She'd driven to the old house they'd moved from 2 years ago, sitting in the driveway for 10 minutes before remembering. It's just hormones, her sister Carol had said. Get the patch, take the supplements. It passes. But what Carol didn't understand, what no one seemed to understand, was that Grace wasn't just losing estrogen. She was losing the internal compass that had guided her through every storm for 5 decades. That night, she found herself in the bathroom at 11:47 p.m., staring at her reflection. The face looking back was hers but not hers, familiar but foreign. Like her emotions, her very self had become unrecognizable. She touched the mirror, wondering if the woman on the other side knew something this version of herself had forgotten. Who are you becoming? She asked her reflection. The question hung in the air like incense, holy and haunting. Then, without warning, she laughed. Actually laughed at herself, standing in her bathroom talking to a mirror at midnight. The laugh turned into crying, then back to laughing, then both at once. And for the first time in months, she didn't try to stop it or make sense of it. She just let the emotional storm pass through her like weather, wild and necessary. A Proverbs 31 woman doesn't fall apart over hot flashes. Grace whispered this accusation to herself while loading the dishwasher Thursday evening. She'd led marriage seminars, written devotionals about perseverance, counseled younger women through their valleys. And here she was, undone by her own body's natural transition. The shame felt heavier than the fatigue. She should be stronger, more faithful, more grateful. After all, she had Jim's support, good health insurance, a comfortable life. Women throughout history had passed through menopause without therapy apps and hormone specialists. Her mother had never mentioned struggling like this. Neither had her aunts. Were they stronger, more spiritual? Or had they just hidden it better, suffering in silence behind their Sunday smiles? Honey, dinner was perfect, Jim said, bringing his plate to the sink. Perfect. She'd burned the rice and forgotten to season the chicken. He was being kind, and somehow that made the guilt worse. She thought about the prayer warrior she used to be. 4 a.m. intercession. Fasting Fridays. Spiritual warfare that moved mountains. Now she could barely manage a 5-minute devotion without her mind scattering like startled birds. I should be stronger by now, she told the darkness of their bedroom later. Jim was already asleep. The clock read 12:33 a.m. Another sleepless night stretching ahead. But then a thought intruded, unbidden and unexpected. What if strength isn't what you think it is? The voice was so clear she actually looked around the room. But no one was there. Just her, the darkness, and a question that would haunt her until she found its answer. She grabbed her phone, about to Google spiritual failure during menopause, then stopped. What if this wasn't failure at all? What if the breaking was the point? What if God was redefining strength in her life, and she was too busy judging herself to notice? The digital clock glowed like an accusation. 3:47 a.m. Grace had been awake for 20 minutes already, her heart racing from another hot flash, sheets damp with perspiration. But this time felt different. The house held a peculiar stillness, as if creation itself was holding its breath. She slipped out of bed, her feet finding the cool hardwood floor. Instead of reaching for her phone to scroll through insomnia forums, she felt pulled toward the living room window that faced east. The world outside was suspended between night and dawn. Not quite dark, not quite light. A threshold moment. And suddenly, Grace understood she was living in her own threshold, not just physical, but spiritual. "I'm listening," she whispered to the pre-dawn quiet. Not a desperate prayer this time, but an invitation. What came wasn't words, but a knowing. A gentle awareness that maybe, just maybe, she'd been trying so hard to hold on to her old way of connecting with God, that she'd missed him knocking at a new door. She grabbed her journal, not to write prayers, but to simply sit with the silence. No agenda, no structure, no proper way to seek him, just presence. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the need to explain her tears or justify her confusion. She just let herself be exactly where she was, 56 hormonal, uncertain, and somehow, mysteriously held. The house creaked softly, that settling sound homes make in the deep night. But to Grace, it sounded like God adjusting his position to sit more comfortably beside her. Not fixing anything, not explaining anything, just being with her in the dark threshold before dawn. She wrote one line in her journal. "What if you're not silent? What if I've just been listening for the wrong voice?" The thought felt like blasphemy and breakthrough simultaneously. Could God's voice change? Or was it her ears that were being reformed? Grace had read every classic on spiritual dryness. St. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul. Mother Teresa's letters about feeling abandoned by God. She'd taught lessons on wilderness seasons, those stretches where God feels distant but is actually doing deep work. But sitting with her counselor, Patricia, on a rainy Thursday, she struggled to explain why this felt different. "In a dark night of the soul, you still know who you are," Grace said, fidgeting with her wedding ring. "You're just waiting for God to feel close again." But this, I don't even recognize my own reactions anymore. Yesterday, I laughed hysterically at a funeral program typo, then cried because the coffee was too hot. Patricia, 62 herself, leaned forward. What if this isn't spiritual dryness at all? What if God is fully present, but your body's transition is changing how you perceive everything, including him? The thought landed like a revelation and a betrayal simultaneously. Grace had always separated body and spirit into neat categories. Physical trials were one thing, spiritual battles another. The idea that hormones could affect her ability to sense God felt like heresy. But that would mean my faith has been dependent on estrogen. Grace's voice cracked. Patricia smiled gently. Or it means God designed our bodies and spirits to be more interconnected than we realized. Maybe menopause isn't interrupting your spiritual life, maybe it's expanding it. Grace felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of a knot she hadn't realized was there. "So you're saying God knew this would happen? That he designed faith to survive hormonal chaos?" "Survive?" Patricia laughed softly. "Honey, what if he designed faith to thrive in it? What if the chaos is the curriculum?" The rain against the windows suddenly sounded like applause. Grace had been treating her body like a traitor to her spirit. What if they were actually collaborators in a transformation she didn't yet understand? Grace's Bible lay open to Romans 8, the pages marked with decades of highlighting, notes cramped in the margins from sermons. Revelations, middle of the night comfort. Verses she could recite in her sleep. But this morning, they might as well have been grocery receipts. "Nothing can separate us from the love of God," she read aloud, trying to force feeling into the words. Nothing landed. The phrases that once set her soul on fire now felt like reading a stranger's mail. She tried Psalms. David's raw emotions had always resonated. Nothing. Proverbs for wisdom. Ecclesiastes for perspective. Even Jesus's words in red seemed to float past her consciousness without anchoring anywhere. At the Thursday morning Bible study, She sat silent while others shared insights from the week's passage. These women she'd taught and led for years now seemed to inhabit a spiritual dimension she couldn't access. "Grace, you're quiet today," Martha observed. "What did God show you in this passage?" She wanted to say nothing. She wanted to scream that God hadn't shown her anything in weeks. Instead, she deflected, still processing. "You know, listening more than talking lately." Martha nodded approvingly. Sometimes that's exactly where God wants us. If only Martha knew that Grace wasn't choosing contemplative silence, she was drowning in it. But that night, something unexpected happened. Unable to sleep again, Grace picked up her Bible and it fell open to Job 42:3. "Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know." The words hit differently at 2 a.m. with hot flash sweat cooling on her skin. Maybe scripture hadn't gone flat. Maybe she'd been trying to read it with yesterday's eyes. She grabbed a fresh notebook, not her organized prayer journal, and started writing questions instead of answers. What if I've been so busy teaching scripture that I forgot how to be taught by it? What if knowing less is actually knowing more? What if confusion is just the beginning of a deeper kind of clarity? Sunday morning, Grace stood with hands raised during worship, the perfect picture of devotion. She knew the motions, the words, the appropriate moments to nod and say amen. Muscle memory carried her through the service like an autopilot she couldn't switch off. But Monday morning at 7:23 a.m., she threw a coffee mug against the kitchen wall. Jim had simply asked if she'd seen his reading glasses. An innocent question that somehow triggered rage so sudden and foreign that Grace frightened herself. The mug shattered. Coffee dripped down white paint, and she stood there shaking, unable to explain why his gentle question felt like an assault. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she gasped, reaching for paper towels, but Jim caught her hands. "Grace, stop. It's okay. Talk to me." How could she explain that she'd felt more genuine throwing that mug than she had with her hands raised in worship? That her anger felt more real than her recent prayers? That she trusted her Monday chaos more than her Sunday composure? The disconnect was eating her alive. Church Grace and home Grace had become two different people, and she didn't know which one was real anymore. Maybe neither, maybe both. That evening, she skipped the prayer meeting for the first time in 8 years. Instead, she sat in her car in the church parking lot, watching others go inside, wondering if any of them were also performing their faith while falling apart in private. Her phone lit up with a text from the prayer group leader. "Missed you tonight. Everything okay?" Grace stared at the message for 5 minutes, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Finally, she typed, "No, but maybe that's okay." She deleted it, wrote "family situation, prayers appreciated," and hit send. Another performance, another lie to maintain the image. But as she drove home, something broke loose in her chest. Not her faith, her need to fake it. Tomorrow, she decided, she would tell someone the truth, even if that someone was just God. Even if the truth was just, "I don't know how to find you anymore." The text came from Diane. "Someone Grace barely knew from church. Saw you in the parking lot last week. I sit in my car sometimes too. Menopause? One word." That's all it took for Grace to break her isolation. They met for coffee that Wednesday at a diner outside town, away from church eyes. 18 months, Diane said, stirring sugar into her coffee. 18 months of feeling like an alien in my own life. No one at church talks about it. We share prayer requests for everything else: cancer, job loss, wayward children, but not this. Grace felt tears of relief. "I thought I was losing my faith." "Oh honey, no, you're losing your old way of having faith. Big difference." Diane pulled out a worn notebook. "I started writing down what no one tells us. Want to hear?" Grace nodded, desperate. "No one says that menopause can trigger a spiritual crisis. That you might need to relearn how to pray. That God might feel different not because he's moved, but because your entire internal landscape is shifting. No one mentions that the warriors become wanderers for a season, and that's holy too." They talked for 3 hours. About night sweats becoming prayer times, about brain fog teaching surrender, about rage becoming a teacher if you let it. Why don't we talk about this at church? Grace asked. Diane laughed bitterly. Because we're supposed to have it all together by now. We're the mentors, remember? Listen, Diane continued, leaning in conspiratorially. There are more of us. Margaret in the choir, she's been setting her alarm for 4 a.m. because that's the only time she feels sane enough to pray. Linda from the mission committee, she told me she's been hiding in the bathroom during service because worship music makes her cry uncontrollably now. We're all pretending to be fine while secretly Googling spiritual crisis menopause at 2 a.m. Grace felt the room spin slightly, not from hormones this time, but from the recognition that she'd been suffering in isolation when she was surrounded by fellow travelers. We need to talk about this. Openly, huh? Diane's laugh was sharp. You want to stand up in church and say, "Hi, I'm Grace, and my hot flashes make me want to throw him books." They'd have us in counseling before the closing prayer. Friday, 4:15 a.m. Grace knelt by her bed, desperate enough to try bargaining with God like she hadn't since her 20s. Take this away, she prayed. The hot flashes, the mood swings, the confusion, I'll take it all. But please, God, give me back my connection to you. Give me back my faith. Give me back my ability to feel you near. Silence. She pressed harder. I'll fast, I'll serve more, I'll lead another Bible study. Just please, make me feel like myself again. Make me feel you again. The silence stretched until it became something else. Not absence, but presence. Not abandonment, but invitation. And in that silence, a different prayer emerged. One she didn't plan. What if I stop asking you to take me back to who I was? The words surprised her. She continued, barely whispering. What if this isn't about getting back to anything? What if you're not silent but speaking in a tone I've never heard before? What if my old prayers don't work because you're teaching me a new language? Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, so gently she almost missed it. Like the first hint of dawn when you're not sure if the darkness is actually lifting or if your eyes are playing tricks. She stayed on her knees but stopped talking. Stopped asking, stopped trying, just stayed. And in that staying, that not trying, she heard it. Not words but knowing. I'm not asking you to be who you were. I'm inviting you to become who you're becoming. The knowing deepened, spreading through her like warm honey. Every woman who's ever transitioned has walked this path. Sarah laughed at an impossible promise. Hannah wept for what seemed withheld. Mary said yes to mystery. You're in good company, daughter. This confusion is ancient and sacred. Grace's tears changed quality, from desperate to wondering. She wasn't falling apart, she was being carefully, lovingly, dismantled and rebuilt. And the architect hadn't abandoned the project, he was just working in a different style than she recognized. The voice came during Tuesday's grocery run, somewhere between the frozen foods and dairy aisle. Not audible, but undeniable. Like recognizing your mother's handwriting on an envelope. Stop fighting this season, Grace. She froze, holding a carton of eggs. An elderly man maneuvered his cart around her, muttering about people blocking aisles, but Grace couldn't move. The presence she'd been desperately seeking for months suddenly felt as close as her own breath. This isn't your faith falling apart. This is your faith being reformed. The tears came, but different this time. Not the random hormonal floods that left her confused, but tears of recognition. Like meeting someone you've been searching for, only to realize they've been walking beside you the whole time. She abandoned her cart and walked to her car, sitting in the parking lot as understanding washed over her. Every symptom she'd been fighting, the emotional chaos, the mental fog, the spiritual confusion, what if they weren't obstacles to her faith, but invitations to a deeper kind of trust? You mean I'm supposed to flow with this? She asked aloud, not overcome it. The response came as an image, a river in flood season. Fighting the current exhausts you. Flowing with it carries you to new territory. For months, she'd been swimming upstream, trying to maintain her premenopause spiritual practices, her old certainties, her familiar ways of connecting with God, exhausting herself to stay in place. Another image came, a snake shedding its skin, uncomfortable, vulnerable, necessary. The old covering had served its purpose, but staying in it once it started peeling would mean suffocation. The shedding wasn't death, it was growth. Grace sat in her car for an hour, engine off, ice cream melting in someone else's abandoned cart, just receiving revelation after revelation. Her menopause wasn't a detour from her spiritual path, it was the path. The symptoms weren't problems to solve but teachers to follow. The confusion wasn't failure but the fog that comes before a new dawn. That evening, Grace's Bible fell open to Isaiah 43, not by divine intervention but because the binding was broken there from years of returning to verse 19. But tonight, she read it with new eyes. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? She'd always read this as a promise about external circumstances changing. New job, new ministry, new season of life. But sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, she understood differently. The new thing wasn't outside her. It was happening within her. God wasn't changing her circumstances, He was changing her capacity to experience Him. She grabbed her journal and wrote frantically. What if menopause is holy ground? What if this dismantling isn't destruction, but divine renovation? What if every hot flash is burning away what no longer serves? What if the confusion is just the dust that rises when God is restructuring foundations? Her handwriting grew messier as insights flooded. I've been trying to preserve who I was instead of discovering who I'm becoming. I've been grieving the loss of my spiritual rhythm instead of learning a new dance. I've been treating menopause like an interruption to my spiritual life when maybe it is. My spiritual life right now. Jim found her an hour later, surrounded by journals, Bibles, and tear-stained tissues, but smiling for the first time in months. You okay? He asked cautiously. No, she laughed. I'm being made new. Completely different thing. She showed him the journal entry, watched his face soften as he read. So you're saying God is using hot flashes as a spiritual discipline? I'm saying God wastes nothing, not even hormone fluctuations. She stood, energy coursing through her that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with revelation. Jim, what if the church has been getting this wrong? What if menopause isn't something to endure, but something to embrace? What if it's not about losing who we were, but discovering who we've always been, underneath all the performing? Jim pulled her close. Then you'd better help other women discover this too. Wednesday's therapy session with Patricia took an unexpected turn when Grace walked in and announced, I get it now. Menopause isn't a medical condition to manage. It's a threshold to cross. Patricia set down her tea. Tell me more. Every threshold in Scripture requires leaving something behind. The Israelites leaving Egypt, Ruth leaving Moab, the disciples leaving their nets. We call it faith, but it's also loss. You can't enter the promised land while camping in Egypt. Grace stood, pacing with energy she hadn't felt in months. I've been treating menopause like a disease, something to cure or endure. But what if it's more like spiritual labor? What if we're birthing our next selves? Labor is painful, messy, overwhelming, but it's not pathological. It's productive. Patricia leaned forward. So what are you birthing? Grace paused at the window, watching clouds shift and reshape across the sky. A woman who doesn't need to control her emotions to feel faithful. A woman who can trust God in the fog, not just in the clarity. A woman who can flow instead of force. She turned back to Patricia. For 56 years, I've been a spiritual warrior, fighting battles, standing firm, holding ground. But what if this season is teaching me to be a spiritual dancer instead, moving with the rhythm instead of against it? Patricia smiled. That sounds like wisdom. No, Grace corrected. That sounds like soul flowing. I just didn't know it had a name. She sat back down, but on the edge of her seat, hands animated as she spoke. Think about it, we've been taught that spiritual maturity means stability, consistency, predictability. But what if God's teaching us through menopause that maturity can also mean fluidity, adaptability? What if the goal isn't to maintain who we were, but to become who we're meant to be? Patricia was taking notes now, nodding. You're describing a complete paradigm shift. It's bigger than that, Grace insisted. It's permission. Permission to be in process. Permission to not have it together. Permission to let our spirituality match our reality instead of forcing our reality to match some impossible spiritual standard. The shift happened at 2:11 a.m. on a Thursday, another wakeful night, but Grace didn't reach for her phone or her Bible or her prayer list. She simply sat in the darkness and made a decision that changed everything. She stopped asking God to fix her, not in defeat, but in recognition. What if she wasn't broken? What if this uncomfortable, unpredictable, transformative process was exactly right? What if God wasn't absent from her menopause but orchestrating through it? I'm done apologizing for my hormones, she whispered to the darkness. I'm done treating my emotions as enemies. I'm done believing that spiritual maturity means emotional stability. She thought about Jesus weeping, raging in the temple, sweating blood in Gethsemane. Emotional intensity wasn't unspiritual. Suppression was. Thank you, she prayed, and meant it. Thank you for the hot flashes that wake me to pray. Thank you for the tears that keep my heart soft. Thank you for the rage that shows me what needs changing. Thank you for the confusion that makes me depend on you differently. Each gratitude felt like releasing a clenched fist. Her shoulders dropped, her breathing deepened. For the first time since menopause began, she wasn't fighting her body or her emotions or her changing spiritual landscape. She was simply being with all of it, present to the mess and the mystery simultaneously. And in that acceptance, that radical receiving of her actual experience, she felt God smile, not fixing her, celebrating the courage it took to stop performing stability and start embodying authenticity. She got up and walked to the bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror, really looked. The woman staring back wasn't the composed ministry leader she'd been for decades. This woman had wild hair, tear tracks on her cheeks, and eyes that held storms. And for the first time, Grace didn't want to fix her. This woman was real, raw, ready. I see you, she told her reflection. And you're not broken, you're breaking open. There's a difference. The distinction hit like lightning. Broken things need repair. Things breaking open are revealing what's inside. And what was inside, Grace, what had always been inside but covered by years of performance and propriety, was pure, flowing, liquid gold, faith, not solid anymore, not structured, but infinitely more valuable in its fluid state. Grace met Diane at the diner again, but this time she came with a different energy. Diane noticed immediately. Something's shifted in you, Diane observed. You're not fighting anymore. I'm learning to flow, Grace replied, then explained what had been emerging in her dawn hours. It's like instead of trying to maintain my old spiritual disciplines, despite menopause, I'm letting menopause teach me new ones. She pulled out a notebook. Not her old prayer journal with its rigid structure, but something new. The pages were messier, more organic. Prayers mixed with symptoms. Scripture woven through hormone tracking. Drawings in the margins. Look, Grace showed Diane. Instead of fighting the 3 a.m. wake-ups, I'm treating them as vigil hours. Instead of hating the brain fog, I'm using it to practice presence. When I can't hold 10 thoughts, I hold on to one word from God. Diane's eyes widened. You're not managing menopause, you're partnering with it. Exactly. I call it soul flowing. Not pushing through the current, but finding God's movement within it. Like this morning, hot flash during my prayer time. Old me would have been frustrated, stopped to cool down, lost momentum. But I stayed with it, prayed through the heat, and it felt like the burning bush. Holy heat. Grace traced her finger across a page where she'd written, what if every symptom is a spiritual teacher? Brain fog teaches surrender. Mood swings teach compassion. Insomnia teaches vigil. Hot flashes teach intensity. Memory loss teaches presence. Diane grabbed the notebook, studying it like a treasure map. This is revolutionary. You're saying our symptoms aren't obstacles to overcome, but opportunities to encounter God differently. I'm saying more than that. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. as if sharing the location of buried treasure. I'm saying menopause might be one of the most spiritually formative experiences of a woman's life. But we've been taught to just survive it instead of learn from it. We take hormones to minimize it, when maybe we should be taking notes to maximize it. But what does it actually look like? Diane pressed. Day to day, practically. Grace smiled. It looks like dancing instead of marching. Like rivers instead of roads. Like becoming instead of maintaining. It looks like finally admitting that the way we've been doing faith might have been too small for what God wanted to give us. Friday morning, 5 a.m. Grace sat in her prayer chair. But everything was different. No timer, no list, no agenda, just presence. Her prayers had become geological, slow, deep, shifting at tectonic pace. Where she once prayed through dozens of requests in her morning hour, now she might hold a single word for 20 minutes. Today's word, receive. She didn't analyze it, didn't build theology around it. Just let it settle into her bones like morning mist into valleys. Her breathing slowed to match its rhythm. Receive, inhale, exhale. The word became less thought and more throb, syncing with her heartbeat. This would have felt like failure before. Lazy prayer. Undisciplined spirituality. But now she understood. Her bandwidth had changed, and God was meeting her exactly there. One deep word was worth more than 50 surface ones. Jim found her there an hour later, still in the chair, eyes closed but fully awake. You okay? He whispered. She opened her eyes slowly, like someone returning from a far country. I'm learning that prayer doesn't have to be productive to be powerful. That afternoon, she threw away her prayer spreadsheets. The color-coded intercession schedule. The systematic Bible reading plan that had governed her mornings for 2 decades. Not in rebellion, but in recognition, those tools served their season. This season required different instruments. She kept one thing, a simple card where she'd written today, I flow with God, not ahead or behind, but with. As she tossed the old prayer journals into the recycling bin, she felt a pang, not of loss, but of gratitude. Thank you for serving me, she whispered to the pages. Thank you for the structure that held me until I was ready to flow. Jim watched from the doorway. Aren't you afraid you'll forget to pray for people without your lists? Grace turned to him, a knowing smile playing at her lips. I'm learning that God remembers what I forget. And that maybe, just maybe, my forgetting makes room for his remembering. My weakness, showcasing his strength. Isn't that what Paul meant about power being perfected in weakness? Sunday after church, Grace's friend Linda cornered her with concern. You've been so quiet lately. You haven't signed up to lead anything this fall. Are you okay? Is it the menopause? Old Grace would have launched into explanations. Justified her choices. Reassured everyone she was still spiritual, still committed, still herself. But soul-flowing Grace simply smiled and said, I'm listening more these days. It had become her practice in conversations, in prayer, in life. Less explaining, more receiving. Less talking, more presence. The hormonal fluctuations that scrambled her ability to articulate complex thoughts had become her teacher in the art of sacred listening. During Wednesday's Bible study, when asked to share, she said simply, I'm sitting with that passage, just sitting. No one knew what to do with that. They were used to Grace's insights, her theological connections, her practical applications. But Grace was discovering that wisdom could be wordless. That sometimes the most spiritual response was no response. That listening, really listening, required the kind of emptiness menopause was creating in her, whether she wanted it or not. That evening, she sat with her journal, but didn't write. Just held the pen and listened. To her body, to her breath, to the space between heartbeats where God seemed to whisper in frequencies only the hormonally humbled could hear. I'm becoming a wisdom keeper, she told the empty page, not by accumulating more knowledge, but by making space for mystery. Then something extraordinary happened. As she sat in silence, she began to hear things she'd never noticed before. The refrigerator's hum carried a rhythm. The clock's tick had a message. Even her own breathing seemed to be spelling out words in Morse code. Let go, trust, flow. She realized that for 56 years, she'd been so busy talking to God that she'd rarely let him get a word in. Her prayers had been monologues disguised as dialogues. But menopause, with its brain fog and verbal struggles, had finally shut her up long enough to hear what had always been there, the still, small voice that didn't shout over her noise but waited patiently for her silence. The familiar verse ambushed her during a Tuesday hot flash. She was driving when the heat wave hit, pulling into a parking lot to wait it out. Radio off, windows down. And suddenly, Psalm 46:10 wasn't just words but experience. Be still and know that I am God. But this time, she heard it differently. Not be still as a command to stop being anxious. Not be still as spiritual discipline. But be still as let yourself be held. The hot flash intensified, and instead of fighting it, she leaned back and imagined herself held by the heat, held by the uncomfortable, held by the uncontrollable, held by God in the middle of what her body was doing without her permission. Be still, stop trying to escape this. And know, not think, not believe, but know in your bones, that I am God, especially here, especially now, especially in this. The tears came, but gentle ones. She wasn't being still. She was being stilled. Like a child fighting sleep, finally surrendering to a parent's arms. Menopause wasn't taking away her control. It was revealing she'd never really had it. And that was freedom. She pulled out her phone and texted Diane. Just had a holy hot flash. God is in the heat. Diane texted back, yes, the burning but not consumed. You're getting it. That night, Grace rewrote Psalm 46:10 in her journal. Be held and know that I am God. Be held in the chaos. Be held in the confusion. Be held in the uncontrollable. And no, not later, not when it's over. But right now, in the middle of it, I am God. Then she went deeper, translating other familiar verses through her menopause lens. My grace is sufficient became my grace flows through your fluctuations. Cast all your cares became release control of what was never yours. Peace that passes. Understanding became peace that doesn't require understanding. Each translation felt like recovering sight after blindness. The Bible hadn't changed. Her capacity to receive it had expanded. Menopause had broken open her spiritual containers, and now scripture was pouring in through cracks she didn't know existed. Saturday, 5:47 a.m. Grace woke not to anxiety or hot flashes but to something she hadn't felt in months, peace. Not the exhausted peace of resignation but the vibrant peace of alignment. She lay still, afraid to move and break whatever spell had settled over her. Her body felt quiet, no rushing hormones, no racing heart, no night sweats, but her soul felt extraordinarily awake, like a tuning fork struck and resonating at perfect pitch. This was soul flowing. Not the absence of symptoms, but the presence of flow despite them. She'd spent months trying to quiet her menopausal body so her soul could thrive. But this morning she understood. Her body's rest wasn't prerequisite to spiritual awakening. They could dance separately and still be in rhythm. She rose slowly, maintaining the flow state like carrying a full cup of water. Made coffee with attention, but not anxiety. Opened her Bible without agenda, letting it fall where it would. Jeremiah 1-5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. The words landed differently. God knew her before she had hormones, would know her after. Knew her in the fluctuation and the flowing. Her spiritual identity wasn't dependent on biological stability. Jim found her on the porch an hour later, watching sunrise paint the sky in phases, dark to gray, to pink, to gold. Like her own transition. You look different, he said. I'm the same, she replied. Just flowing now instead of fighting. He sat beside her, and they watched the world wake up together. Explain this soul-flowing thing to me again, he said, but like I'm 5. Grace laughed softly. Remember when Emma was learning to swim, how she'd fight the water, exhausting herself trying to stay afloat. Then one day she discovered if she just laid back and trusted, the water would hold her. Jim nodded. That's soul-flowing. I've been fighting to stay spiritually afloat, thrashing against every menopause symptom. But this morning I discovered that if I stop fighting and start trusting, someone holds me. The symptoms don't disappear, but they stop being enemies. They become the very water that teaches me to float. The change was subtle enough that Grace didn't notice until her daughter Emma pointed it out during Sunday lunch. "Mom, you're different lately. Softer, but somehow stronger. I can't explain it." Grace set down her fork, considering. Emma was right. The faith she'd carried for decades, angular, defended, fortified, had become something else. Like river stones worn smooth by water, her beliefs hadn't eroded. They'd been refined. "I used to think faith meant being certain about everything," Grace told her daughter. "Having answers. Standing firm. But menopause taught me that faith can be fluid and still be faith. Maybe more so." She thought about the woman she'd been just 6 months ago. Prayer warrior. Bible study leader. The one with answers. That woman's faith had been muscular, built on discipline and determination. This new faith, it was like water, taking the shape of whatever container life provided while maintaining its essential nature. Soft enough to yield, strong enough to carve canyons. "I stopped trying to wrestle blessings from God," Grace continued. "Started receiving what was already being given. Even the hard things. Especially the hard things." That evening, she wrote in her journal, "My faith used to be an armor. Now it's a river. Both protect, but differently. Armor by resistance. River by flow. I'm learning that yielding requires more strength than fighting ever did." Emma had stayed for dinner, and as they cleaned up together, she asked, "Mom, are you ever afraid you'll lose yourself in all this flowing? Like, what if you flow so much you disappear?" Grace dried a plate slowly, considering. "I thought that too at first. But here's what I learned. Water doesn't disappear when it flows. It finds its way. It shapes landscapes. It sustains life. I'm not losing myself by flowing in. I'm finally finding myself. The self that exists beneath all the roles and rules and requirements." Emma hugged her then, tight and long. "I like this version of you, Mom. She feels more real." "She is," Grace whispered into her daughter's hair. "She finally is." The email arrived on a Wednesday morning from Pastor Williams. "Grace, would you consider leading a new ministry?" Her old self would have immediately said yes. Duty, calling, service, the trinity of her former faith. But soul-flowing Grace sat with a request for 3 days, listening for the deeper invitation. On the third morning, at 4:30 a.m., clarity came. Not in words, but in vision. A room full of women in transition. Not just menopause, but all the thresholds women cross in silence. Divorce, empty nest, career endings, loss, aging. Women who needed to learn what she'd learned, how to flow when you can't fight. She met with Pastor Williams that Friday. "I'll do it, but it won't look like traditional women's ministry," she warned. "No pretty devotionals about being gentle and quiet. This is for women in the thunder of transition. Women whose faith is being reformed by fire." He looked uncertain. "What would you call it?" "The 5 a.m. Sisters. For every woman who's been awakened by insomnia, anxiety, or God into a new rhythm. We'll meet early, before the world needs us to be put together. We'll practice soul flowing." Soul flowing, Grace smiled. The art of moving with God when everything else is moving too. Not spiritual warfare, but spiritual water. Learning to flow with divine rhythm when your own rhythm is disrupted. Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My wife went through menopause last year. She said church felt irrelevant to what she was experiencing. Maybe this is exactly what we need." "It's more than that," Grace said, standing now, energy coursing through her. "This is about telling the truth about female spirituality. We've been teaching women to be Proverbs 31 warriors when some seasons call us to be Psalm 42 deer panting for water. We've been preaching strength when sometimes survival is the miracle. We've been demanding consistency when God might be teaching flexibility." She pulled out her phone, showed him a text from Diane. 17 women ready to meet. All in transition. All tired of pretending. All ready for something real. 17. Pastor Williams looked surprised. That's just from one coffee conversation and a few texts. Pastor, there's an epidemic of women suffering in spiritual silence because the church doesn't have language for hormonal holiness. We're about to change that. The first gathering of the 5 a.m. sisters wasn't advertised on the church bulletin board or announced from the pulpit. Grace simply sent a text to 5 women she'd seen struggling to maintain their spiritual facade through life transitions. Tuesday, 5 a.m., my living room. Come as you are, especially if that's a mess. We're learning something called soul flowing. 7 women showed up. 2 in pajamas, 1 with tears already streaming. Another admitted she'd had 3 glasses of wine the night before just to sleep. Real women, raw women, ready women. Grace opened with truth. I started this because menopause almost destroyed my faith. Not because God abandoned me, but because I couldn't maintain my old way of reaching Him. I had to learn to flow instead of fight, to receive instead of achieve, to let my spiritual practice match my actual capacity, not my former capability. The room exhaled collectively. She continued, soul flowing isn't another program to master. It's accepting that some seasons require us to move with the current instead of against it. It's discovering that God meets us in the flow, not just in the fight. They didn't open Bibles that morning, didn't recite memory verses, didn't pretend everything was fine. They simply shared where they were. I wake up at 3 a.m. panicked about nothing and everything. I cry in my car after dropping my last child at college. I'm 62 and feel like I'm starting over, but I don't know as what. My prayers feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling. I'm so tired of being strong. Grace nodded at each confession. Welcome to the flow, sisters. This is where transformation happens, not when we have it together, but when we stop pretending we do. She introduced them to the practice. 1-word prayers when you can't form sentences. Dawn vigils when insomnia strikes. Breathing through hot flashes like labor pains because you're birthing something. Treating confusion as holy ground where God is rearranging furniture. But most importantly, Grace said, standing now, energy coursing through her that had nothing to do with hormones and everything to do with purpose. We're going to stop apologizing for being in transition. Stop hiding our struggles. Stop pretending that faith means stability. She looked at each woman, these beautiful warriors learning to become water. Jesus said streams of living water would flow from within us. He never said the flow would be controlled or convenient. Maybe disorder is just another door to the divine. Maybe our chaos is where Christ meets us most tenderly. The sun was rising now, painting Grace's living room in gold. 7 women sat in that light, mascara smeared, hair unbrushed, souls exposed, and somehow, it was the most sacred gathering any of them had attended. Same time next week, asked the woman who'd admitted to the wine. Same time, same mess, same grace. Grace confirmed. We're the 5 a.m. sisters now. We flow together. As they left, each woman hugged Grace with the desperation of someone who'd been lost and finally heard their name called. This wasn't just ministry. This was resurrection. Not from death to life, but from grinding to flowing. But then Margaret, who'd been silent the entire time, stopped at the door. Grace, she whispered, I threw a plate at my husband last night. Then I sat on my kitchen floor and laughed until I cried. I thought I was losing my mind. But listening to you, maybe I'm just finding it. Grace pulled her close. Sister, you're not crazy. You're transitioning. And transitions are always messy in the middle. But that's where the magic happens, in the mess. Grace stood on her porch, watching them drive away into the morning light. 6 months ago, menopause had felt like ending. Now she understood it was beginning. The beginning of a movement that started with hormones and ended with holiness. The beginning of women telling the truth about transition. The beginning of soul flowing not as concept but as community. Her phone buzzed. A text from Diane. Heard you started something. Room for one more. Grace typed back. Room for every woman ready to stop fighting the current and start flowing with it. 5 a.m. Tuesday. Bring your chaos. God's already there. Another text, from an unknown number. Linda gave me your number. I'm 48. early menopause, and I cried through 3 worship services last month. Is that normal? Grace typed, normal is a setting on a washing machine, not a requirement for faith. Tuesday, 5 a.m. You'll fit right in. Within an hour, her phone had 23 new messages. Women from other churches. Women who'd heard whispers of something different. Women desperate for permission to be in process. She looked at the sunrise, now fully golden, and whispered a prayer that wasn't request but recognition. Thank you for the undoing that became my becoming. Thank you for menopause, the uninvited teacher. Thank you for showing me that soul flowing isn't something I do. It's something I become when I stop trying to be who I was and start flowing toward who you're making me. The morning breeze stirred, carrying the scent of jasmine and possibility. Grace Whitmore, 56, menopausal and flowing, stepped into her day knowing that every woman awakened at ungodly hours by hormones or anxiety or God himself was about to discover what she'd learned. The disruption is the invitation. The threshold is the thread. The flowing is the faith. Welcome to the 5 a.m. sisters. Welcome to soul flowing. Welcome home. Grace Whitmore's story isn't unique, it's just uncommonly told. Right now, millions of Christian women over 50 are waking up at 3:47 a.m., wondering if menopause has stolen their faith along with their estrogen. They're sitting in church pews, performing stability while privately falling apart. They're apologizing for symptoms that might actually be sacred invitations. But here's the secret the enemy doesn't want you to know. Every hot flash is potential holy ground. Every sleepless night is a possible vigil. Every mood swing is an opportunity to experience the God who created emotions in the first place. You're not falling apart, you're falling into a deeper kind of faith. Here's what Grace discovered that changes everything. Soul flowing isn't about managing menopause with more prayer discipline. It's about recognizing that when God dismantles your old way of connecting with Him, He's not abandoning you, He's expanding you. Every hot flash can be a burning bush moment. Every bout of brain fog can teach surrender. Every 5 a.m. wake up can become a vigil where you meet God in the threshold between night and dawn. Between who you were and who you're becoming. The 5 a.m. Sisters movement that started in Grace's living room has now spread to 17 churches across 3 states. Women are gathering in the raw hours before dawn, not despite their menopausal chaos, but because of it. They're discovering that spiritual maturity doesn't mean emotional stability. That flowing requires more strength than fighting. That God is just as present in the confusion as He was in the clarity. We just had to learn His new frequency. Last week, Grace received an email that made her weep. I'm 73. I went through menopause 20 years ago in complete spiritual isolation. I thought God had abandoned me. Reading your story, I realized He was trying to teach me to flow, but I didn't have the language for it. Thank you for giving words to what I experienced in silence. If you're in this season, whether it's menopause, empty nest, career transition, or any threshold that's disrupted your spiritual rhythm, know this, you're not falling apart. You're falling into a new kind of faith, one that flows instead of forces, one that receives instead of achieves, one that trusts God in the fog, not just in the clarity. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, stop fighting the current. Start flowing with it. Find your own 5 a.m. sisters, even if it's just one other woman willing to tell the truth about transition. Practice soul flowing in whatever way your capacity allows. One-word prayers, breathing through hot flashes like holy labor, treating insomnia as invitation to vigil. But here's the most important part, the part that will change everything if you let it. Stop waiting for this season to end so your real spiritual life can resume. This is your real spiritual life. This disruption, this confusion, this complete reordering of everything you thought you knew about connecting with God, this is not the interruption, this is the invitation. Remember, God knew you before hormones. He'll know you after. He knows you in the fluctuation and the flowing. Your spiritual identity isn't dependent on biological stability. You are not less spiritual because you're more emotional. You're not less faithful because you're more confused. You're not less loved because you're more lost. You're being reformed, renewed, revealed. Grace's morning routine with God doesn't look anything like it did before menopause. It's messier, slower, deeper, less productive by old standards, more powerful by heaven's measure. She's become living proof that when life disrupts your spiritual practice, it might not be interruption, it might be invitation to discover that the flowing is the faith. So, tomorrow morning, when you wake up at whatever ungodly hour your hormones decide, remember, you're not alone. Grace is awake too. So are thousands of other women learning to flow instead of fight. We're all discovering that menopause isn't a spiritual crisis, it's a spiritual curriculum. And the main lesson: sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is flow. The data shows that 75% of women experience significant spiritual questioning during menopause. But less than 10% ever talk about it in church. That silence ends now. That isolation ends here. That shame stops with this story. Welcome to the movement. Welcome to the 5 a.m. sisters. Welcome to Soul Flowing. The disruption is the invitation. The threshold is the thread. The flowing is the faith. And your story of transformation. It starts the moment you stop apologizing for being in transition. Grace Whitmore threw a coffee mug at her wall and found God laughing in the shards. What will you find when you stop fighting and start flowing?